Ladies and gentlemen, I am here at Frank Saletri, Tombstone. This is Friday, May the 12th, 2023. Frank Saletri, spelled Saletri, was a World War II serviceman and a veteran, combat soldier in World War II. And he also was the producer and writer of a Blackexploitation era horror sci-fi kind of spoof film called Blackenstein, the Black Frankenstein, which I represent the sergeant in that film, James Kissor, and I'm in touch with Ivory Stone, the female lead of that movie. And I'd been doing a deep dive on Frank Saletri recently. Last time I was in this area, I went to his home, which was on Primrose Avenue in Los Angeles, which was rumored to be the former home of Bela Lugosi. And that's kind of disputed to some people, and some people say no, it was Bela Lugosi's former home, but we're not 100% sure if that is the case. I do believe it was the case. So Frank Saletri wrote and produced Blackenstein, which came out in 1973. And he, after that, had wrote some scripts, different scripts, and he had about probably 7 or 8 scripts he had written that went unproduced. In addition to being a creative producer and writer in Hollywood, he was a criminal attorney. And he was murdered on July the 9th, 1982. They suspect around July the 9th, 1982. He had laid dormant in his home, which he lived by himself, for 3 days, they suspected. They found his body in July 12th, 1982, which is why his date of death is attributed to July the 12th, 1982. In addition to that, it's a cold case. I mean, his murder happened between July the 9th and July 12th, 1982. July 12th is when they discovered the body. But it's still a cold case, almost 41 years later. And the interesting thing is there doesn't seem to be any recent attempts to solve his homicide in recent years, because I know it's been a long time ago. DNA and forensics and technology was not what it was back then as it is today. But I do feel that his murder could have been solved, is my personal opinion. And I believe that LAPD still has some of the clothing he had worn when they found his body and some of his belongings with the crime scene, and were involved in the crime scene. It's suspected that somebody he probably knew or knew of had tortured him and then executed him, because they used a screwdriver to create holes in his elbows and back behind his ears. And I do believe he was shot ultimately, but he went through suffering. It wasn't like an instantaneously thing. What can I say? I mean, Blackenstein was one of the more interesting, entertaining films of that era. And he's got about 7 or 8 scripts he's written, but they were never produced. So I'm in touch with his niece, who lives in Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm optioning the scripts to produce them as the producer, because I want to honor his legacy, and I want to produce the films in his honor and his family's honor. My personal opinion on the case of his murder is that he was a criminal attorney in addition to everything else. And I believe that it was somebody he had either represented as an attorney that may have been convicted anyway. Yeah, he maybe to this person, he had not represented them to their expectations. I don't know. I have a conspiracy theory about that. Or it could have been somebody he convicted. But I do know that 3 weeks before his murder, he paid up on the his life insurance policy. He changed the locks on his door, and he had been in fear of his life. Prior to him being murdered, a friend of his was over at his house, and somebody had spread word that somebody's on their way to do him harm, and he jumped off his property, went to the next door neighbors, kind of hid out, and then came back later, and nothing happened that day. But then later on, a couple weeks later, that's when his murder occurred. His sister had issued a award for his murder, to be solved in 1986. She had issued a $10,000 reward for anybody that had information to come forward to help solve the murder of Frank R. Saletri. And then his niece had matched that last year, another $10,000 reward. So there's a $20,000 reward for the information leading to the conviction or apprehension and conviction of the murderer or murderers of Frank Saletri. And I want to give credit to my client, Scott Michaels, because he has a company called Dearly Departed Tours. And Scott had interviewed Frank Salatri's niece as of last year. That's where I got that information about the reward. The reward's still present. Today, currently, is a $20,000 reward for the apprehension or conviction of the murderer or murderers that killed Frank Saletri. So it's been 41 years in July. In 2 months, July the 12th, this year, 2023, it'll be 41 years since he had been murdered. And I just hope that there's some type of peace and eventual closing, resolution to his murder, because it's a shame when you lose a loved one, especially that way, and it goes unsolved. My father's father, my grandfather, was murdered when my father was 16 years old, and that's a cold case, and that happened in 1970. And 53 years later, actually, it's still unsolved. My grandfather had an affair with a married woman that produced a son. My dad has a half-brother in the world he's never met. And shortly after that affair, my grandfather was shot and killed in cold blood, and they found him with a bullet hole to his head, laying in a bed. And they suspected it was the woman he had an affair with, or it might have been her husband. But for all intended purposes, nobody was ever convicted of that crime. It's still a cold case. It happened in Owensboro, Kentucky in 1970. I'm not sure exactly what month, but I do know how it is to lose a loved one via murder, because I never met my grandfather, obviously. I was born in 1980. But I knew what it was like growing up in my grandfather's murderer's shadow. And when you grow up in the murder of someone's shadow, that's a hard toll to hold. Because I grew up without grandparents. They were all passed away primarily before I was born. And I know how that is. So my heart goes out to Frank Salatri's niece. So I'm going to give you guys a look at Frank Salatri's tombstone. Hold on, let's see here. Reverse this.